invite you to start the meeting.
Good morning, everybody. I'm David Jamieson. I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands. It's Tuesday, the 15th of September at 10 a.m. and I welcome you to the West Midlands Strategic Policing and Crime Board. We have a fairly full agenda today that is published on our website. But before we actually start, I just wanted to say a few words about the truly appalling events of the weekend before last. These tragic and brutal events happened in the early hours of Sunday, the 6th of September in Birmingham city centre, when a young man was stabbed and lost his life, and others are still in hospital recovering from some very, very serious injuries. I'm sure that everybody's thoughts are with the young man's family who's died, and with the friends and relatives of those who have suffered such dreadful injuries. We are not going to be discussing the issue in detail today because various things are happening, not least the impending court case and other inquiries that may take place, and we must not do or say anything that crosses over the activity that's happening in other areas. But I would like to say I'm pleased to hear that our office has acted quickly to compile and analyse evidence available to track down a suspect and make an arrest. And I hope this offers some comfort to the people of the West Midlands who have so understandably been worried. I'd like also to place on record my sincere thanks to the brave and hard-working police, the hospital and the ambulance staff who acted so quickly to help the victim of this truly awful atrocity. I also pay tribute to those members of the public who are out on the street who also assisted. Although the police and ambulance service arrived very quickly, there were those who assisted on the street, and I do thank them very much for their involvement. I will, of course, be following investigations very closely over the coming days and weeks, and I can confirm that as soon as we're able to, within legal constraints, we will publish a written paper to this board to review the circumstances of the stabbings and the subsequent events so as to ensure any lessons are identified and acted upon. So in the advance of the meeting, I've already asked the Chief Constable to make a statement to the board today to update us and the public as much as is possible legally at the present moment, and also so that we don't tread into the area of other inquiries that are going on and the legal processes. So with that, I'm going to ask the Chief Constable to make a statement. Chief Constable.
So thank you, Commissioner. So today I want to give you and those watching a formal update on the terrible knife attacks that took place on Birmingham City Centre on Sunday, the 6th of September. Because of the legal issues around this, the statement I'll be giving is a written one, and I'll be unable to take additional public questions. So I want to start by speaking about Jacob Billington and the survivors, one of whom remains critically ill. Everybody in the city of Birmingham is stunned by these terrible attacks. The fact that the victims could have been any one of us or any of those we love makes crimes like these seem very, very close to home. And the thoughts of everybody in West Midlands Police are with these victims, their families and friends, and I know this will be the case for everybody here in the city of Birmingham and the West Midlands. Now, while the full facts of this case are matters for criminal and coronial proceedings, I believe it's necessary to address some of the issues concerning the West Midlands Police response as a result of some criticism we faced in the first 24 hours of this tragedy. And I've waited until today, it's appropriate at the board, but also after the initial appearance of the suspect at court and also the coronial inquest beginning yesterday. Now, I want to address the facts so far as I need to without prejudicing those proceedings. So the first issue is there has been some criticism of the force because there's a belief the suspect was allowed to wander around the city centre of Birmingham for 2 hours between the first and final attack. So the first 3 victims' attacks were reported to the police between 12:31 a.m. and 12:52 a.m. on the 6th of September. At 1:23 a.m, the initial investigation identified links between the two incidents. There was then almost an hour's gap until the next two attacks were reported to the police, and they were reported at 1:50 and 1:59. Evidence presented to the court in this case will allege the suspect left the city centre after the first three victims were attacked, returning to another part of the city centre around an hour later, where it is alleged the second two more incidents took place. This addresses why the prime suspect was not located between the two sets of incidents. As you will know, we always try to find suspects immediately after the incidents, and this is not always possible, as complex cases like this demonstrate. The second area of criticism is related to the police response not being fast enough. The response times to the four clusters of attacks are based upon the time from when the emergency call was received and the log created to the moment officers arrived at the scene and notified that on the radio. So to help understand the speed of response, I will set out the time when officers were attended the incident and the point the first officer indicated they had arrived. So the first attack on victim 1, we responded in 7 minutes from the call being received. The first officers arrived 3 minutes after they'd been allocated the call by the control room. Attack 2 involved 2 victims. We responded 30 minutes after the call was received, but officers arrived within 3 minutes after allocation. Attack 3 involved 2 victims. We responded 6 minutes after the call was received, officers arriving 4 minutes after allocation. And attack 4 on 3 people, we responded in 7 minutes after the call was received and officers arriving 4 minutes after allocation. Now, there were a considerable number of officers deployed to each of these calls, particularly attack 3 and attack 4. The numbers of officers who were deployed, as I'll indicate, may not all relate to the log because the volume of radio traffic meant people could not attend. But what I can say is this, so I could not record their attendance on the radio. The Force Duty Inspector at attack 3 and 4 attempted to deploy every officer in the West Midlands Police in the central area of the force as these calls came in. This was later extended to every available officer in the western and eastern parts of the West Midlands Police area that stretches from Wolverhampton to Coventry. Other specialist resources were deployed, including multiple firearms officers, taser units, traffic resources, the police helicopter, and the adjoining police forces were placed on standby to supply additional resources, particularly armed resources if they were required. This was in addition clearly to a joint agency response that involved the ambulance service. I believe the prompt police and equally swift ambulance response will subsequently be shown to have saved lives. The third area that's been raised is people have questioned why we did not give a description or CCTV image of the attacker sooner. Decisions on releasing images and descriptions are made by investigating officers. A very experienced senior investigation officer was appointed, in this case supported by another very experienced strategic investigator, a specialist role used in complex cases, and they reported directly to the Assistant Chief Constable for Crime, who was the strategic commander of the incident. An extensive CCTV trawl was carried out to secure images of the suspect on public and private CCTV in Birmingham city centre by the investigators. An appeal was launched using the UK Police Major Incident Reporting site to quickly secure mobile phone images. And I would like to thank the people for all of the involved in businesses and local residents or people in the city centre for all the help they gave us in assembling this data. In deciding whether to release the details of the suspect, senior officers balanced the risk to the public, the vague nature of the description we had at that stage, and the risk of well-intended but inaccurate reports of sightings alongside what were already active lines of inquiry. This was also influenced by the absence of a good quality CCTV image that would assist identification. We shared images of the suspect at 7 p.m. on the 6th of September. These were the best images secured during the investigation throughout that entire day, and they were downloaded from a private CCTV camera system when we had secured the images at 5:30 p.m, 20 minutes or so after we received them and after they'd been password unlocked by the provider. The suspect was arrested at 4 a.m. on Monday, the 7th of September, 26 hours after the final attack. I believe the decisions on releasing details around the suspect to have been well considered, reasonable, and ultimately assisted the investigation to reach its conclusions. I hope this clarifies these points and addresses any of the public concerns that have been raised. Finally, this is an exceptional incident. The circumstances offer learning not just to West Midlands Police but to UK policing. We have already carried out an initial debrief which will report in due course to the Police and Crime Commissioner. A separate legal process exists to review the management of the suspect by authorities prior to these incidents. And finally, although these terrible crimes were not terror related, Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu, in charge of National Counter-Terrorism Policing, has agreed the National Counter-Terrorism Policing will debrief the incident as policing and our partners seek to refine the joint agency response to marauding attacks. I conclude by saying how proud I am of the response of staff from West Midlands Police on that night, and also those carrying out this investigation, and our job is now to secure justice. Thank you for allowing me the statement, Commissioner.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Constable. And I think it also does underline what you were saying, some of the criticism that was received shortly after the event. There was some of that criticism was seriously uninformed and very unhelpful from people who actually should know better. And I take your point there. And perhaps I hope that some of those people who made that criticism, and some of them were people who are elected to Parliament, they should actually reflect on what they said and perhaps revise how they react in future. Now, although we're not going to have a debate about this here and now for reasons which have been set out, we have a question time of pre-ordered questions, and one of those questions does relate in a way to this event, which doesn't impinge upon the any of the other hearings or inquiries that might be made. So I'm going to ask Tom McNeil if you would ask your question, please, Tom.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning, Chief Constable. What role did the safe space in the Arcadian have in supporting the response to the Birmingham stabbings incident?
Yes, the safe space in the Arcadian is something that we are very enthusiastic and provides help and support to people who are in the West Midlands and visiting Birmingham nighttime economy in that part of the city centre. I can confirm that staff from Safe Space did respond to a number of incidents on the night in question. They attended a number of incidents and assisted people who've been subject to attacks and assisted West Midlands Ambulance Service in the work they're doing. We well know that Safe Space operates well in the city. It's supported by good quality volunteering and is a modestly funded scheme, and that did deliver significant assistance on the night.
Thank you.
Tom?
No, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chief Constable. Is there any other issue anyone wants to raise within the framework of that which we've set out? I see or hear no indications. Chief Constable, thank you very much indeed. And I hope you'll commend your officers who did attend that dreadful event. And I know that since then, this weekend, your officers have been extremely busy in other parts of our nighttime economy. And I do thank them for the work that they're doing. Let us now move on in our agenda. We come to the notes of the last meeting. Firstly, these notes have been circulated. Is there any point of accuracy that anyone wants to make of those notes? I see no indication. There were two items of actions from the previous meeting. One was to do with safer travel. Is there somebody who can update us on those?
So I think in terms of the two actions, I thought we discharged that first one. I know it's an issue Garinda raised. If that's not been discharged, I'll chase that down to see where that information is. In terms of the...
Okay, that was on the safer travel.
It was on the safer travel. In terms of the special constables, I think we've gathered that information. That's available and we're making arrangements to pay so we can share that information. That has been discharged. But if the safer travel one hasn't, I'll make sure that information is provided. It certainly is tracked by the teams.
And the other issue was relating to the special constables who are eligible for bonus allowance. And I think the answer you've given that the special constables were eligible for bonus allowance. 142 were paid this month, which I presume would be August, I would presume. Okay.
Can I come in, Commissioner? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner?
Yes, Chief Constable.
No, it's Jonathan here. It's Jonathan here, Commissioner. Just very quickly. So we have had an email from Claire Bell relating to the safer travel data. That has been circulated out. So that has been received and circulated. So we'll pick that up, and if there are any further questions, we'll feed those back to Claire. Okay.
Okay. Yes, thanks for that clarification, Jonathan. Okay, on to item 3, which is questions from members of the public. We have not received any questions from the members of the public. Gurinder, did you want to come in? I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand immediately. Did you want to come in?
Thank you, Commissioner. Just to say on that report back from the last meeting, we did get that paper. I was quite relieved to see the couple of things in there. One was the confidence that West Midland Travel employees are gaining in reporting incidents and engaging with the police with the approach that's been taken. And I was also quite heartened to see that the crimes are treated as hate crimes wherever that is the case, and that is the thing that's giving confidence to employees to report such crimes. So I think that's a good piece of work.
Yeah, thank you, Gurinder. Okay, we've dealt with item 3. We go on to item 4. There are 3 questions listed. We've already dealt with the first of those questions, but there are 2 more questions to be asked. So I'm going to ask Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner Wahid Salim to ask question 2. Wahid.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Could the Chief Constable outline the impact and cost of increased virtual remand hearing on West Midlands Police?
So thank you for the question. It's a very topical issue that's been discussed by Chief Constable. So if I just set in the context for those on the board or who are listening, that currently the arrangements provided pre-COVID would be that prisoners who were remanded in custody and refused bail by the police or were on warrants were taken to local magistrates' courts where initial hearings would take place as to the nature of whether they should be bailed or remanded into custody. As a result of considerable restrictions placed on the magistrates' court through COVID in particular, policing across the country was asked to support a process of virtual remand hearings, which in effect is a level of video conferencing that takes place from the police cells into the court to avoid the need for transportation by GOAMI. There have been a number of legal complications around it, particularly the legal status of GOAMI employees. The arrangements mean that this is having to be managed by police forces across the country. We are very keen to see the criminal justice system recover, and actually were we to cease the operation of supporting these virtual remand hearings, it would have potentially an impact on the criminal justice system in the courts. That said, policing does need to see a sustained operating plan from the criminal justice system to not only to begin to absorb a normal business. While we've been happy to pay our part, the cost and demands now are becoming considerable, and at some stage the sustainability of this position will need review. Why is that the case? Well, simply detainees are in the West Midlands Police cell estate for longer is starting to directly impact upon our ability to carry out normal business and arrest offenders. There is a considerable level of additional cost, particularly consumables in terms of food, blankets, etc., but also the number of staff that are available to assist with this is inadequate, and it's requiring us on occasions to pay additional costs and overtime. The costs so far relate to somewhere in the region of around £125,000 for the early periods we've got. But we estimate the costs currently are now running at close to £14,000 a week, which will mean we're just over £700,000 cost for us to discharge this service over the year. And I think those costs are modest assessments based upon the actual revenue impact. The actual opportunity cost impact in terms of force will be higher than that. Clearly, my intention is to continue to try and ensure the criminal justice system works effectively and to support this, but there will be coming a point where this is no longer sustainable. It's an area of attention by the National Police Chiefs Council, and as you will well know, it's a direct area of attention for me to make a consideration as to how we begin to return our courts to normality. The arrangements are simply unsustainable in their current impact, and they will have a detrimental effect to policing if they continue. So we will be reviewing that, and we'll be beginning a discussion with the court system about the route to be taken.
Thank you.
Do you want to come back on this question, Wahid?
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chief Constable, for that update. Obviously, in principle, virtual remand hearings should have a positive impact on the criminal justice system to make it more efficient and more agile. However, currently, as you say, we are seeing significant backlogs, which are leaving police custody facilities full for those awaiting hearings. This costs us in additional staffing, and as you said, in significant costs to the police, which currently aren't being supported by the government with additional funding. If government wishes to roll out these hearings out further, they need to give far more and much more detailed consideration to the impact it has happening on existing custody facilities, and to ensure that the hearings can take place more swiftly as well. So I know we will be taking these issues up with the MOJ through the Criminal Justice Task and Finish group that's been set up and that I'm leading on. So thank you for that. Shall I ask my second?
Okay. Wahid, would you like to now ask your question 3, please?
Thank you, Commissioner. Can the Chief Constable outline what activities have taken place to prepare policing for the government's comprehensive spending review?
So thank you for the question. As members of the board and the public may be aware, the Chancellor announced in July that the government would carry out a spending review that would determine government spending for, in revenue terms, around 3 years, for capital maybe up to 4 years. This fiscal event is always incredibly significant for policing because it sets out the overall funding position for the Home Office, which has a direct bearing on the level of resourcing and funding for policing. In terms of the priorities government set, actually reducing crime is in one of the top 3 priorities set for the spending review. Government has indicated its desire to support an uplift of 20,000 police officers in the country, and there is no indication the spending review, the desire to support that, will not be the case. One of the challenges the force has had, and policing in general has had, is that funding has moved over the last few years to be quite unpredictable and based on 1-year settlements. And there are a number of issues that are that are currently in the force's budget. For example, some money for the pension revaluation for employers' costs, some of the funding for ROCUs, some of the funding for firearms, and that are renewed on an annual basis. And I think this is also the case for the Commissioner's funding for violence reduction units and the force's violence work. Clearly, the approach the force has taken to ensure we have a successful spending review is as follows. The first is that there is a National Police Chiefs Council and a Association of Police and Crime Commissioners group that work directly with the Home Office. And as you probably all are aware, I am the finance lead, so I'm one of the members of that group. That group is making sure that policing is able to support Home Office colleagues as they prepare the necessary bids that go into the Treasury to make sure they're comprehensive across the full range of policing, from local policing that we deliver all the way through to counter-terrorism and fighting organised crime. The force has directly supported that work in terms of providing information around financial risks that we see in terms of what we do. And so that helps build a position as to what the ultimate settlement will be. And we've contributed extremely heavily to that, as has the Director of Commercial Services. I'm sure Mark from the PCC's office has also played a part, as he normally does, in those exercises. In terms of our preparation, of course, this is always very difficult because when a spending review happens, we really do not have any clear understanding as to what the actual funding that will be awarded until we have the Chancellor's decisions in autumn and then finally the police settlement in December. But what the force does in conjunction with the Police and Crime Commissioners, Treasurer, is ensure we build a medium-term financial focus that at least bases some assumptions and predictable risk we would face. All public services are impacted upon this, but the work we're doing directly is supporting the National Police Chiefs Council work, and the work we do locally is ensuring that we are still planning ahead and making long-term decisions for the sustainability of the force. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Wahid?
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much for that update, Chief Constable. As members will know, that West Midlands Police has lost over 175 million from its budget since 2010, which has led to having lost over 2,000 police officers, which is causing a significant strain on resources at a time when we see crime increasing. Even with the additional funding of police officer recruitment, West Midlands Police may only see about 1,200 new officers, which is half of what we've lost. I urge the government to consider ensuring that the policing service is fully funded, and their commitment of supporting the police is fulfilled, and we see a funding settlement that is favourable, so that we can able to increase our capacity, but also support communities and keeping them safe. Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Wahid, for your question. Okay, we now move on to items 5 and 6. The first on the criminal justice and response and recovery to coronavirus, and 6 will be the emergency chapter, an update on the action we took there. The emergency chapter is, of course, to the police and crime plan. So I'm going to ask Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner Wahid Salim to chair the meeting for these 2 items. Wahid.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So the first agenda item, as the Commissioner said, is on criminal justice. So I'll invite Meg Jones, the Head of Policy from the PCC's office, to set out the main issues from this paper, and then I'll ask Sarah Matter, who is the Head of Volunteering, to also say a few words. And I'm very pleased to welcome Tony Tyndall, who's one of our independent custody visitors. Welcome, Tony, to the meeting, and I'll ask you to say a few words after Sarah. So Meg, over to you first.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. We will assume that the paper has been read, but want to highlight a couple of key points throughout that document. So the purpose of this report is to provide members an update and an overview of the PCC's role in the criminal justice system, as it sets out in the new emergency chapter of the Police and Crime Plan. The 2 objectives that this links to is 3 and 4. So actually the objective 3 of the emergency plan is leading and supporting a partnership response to the national emergency. And this was a recognition of the civic leadership of the PCC during the pandemic, and the PCC recognised that partnership working across the criminal justice system was key to recovery in this space. The other area that it picks up is translating national COVID-19 plans locally, and ensuring that partnership structures in the West Midlands could respond appropriately to the suspension of Crown Court trials, self-isolation, and the potential for early release of prisoners. At this point, bearing in mind that we responded to the pandemic through regional structures, I just want to hand over to Sarah Gilbert, who will talk through those structures before I then give a brief overview of our local response as well.
So the region's really come together over the last 6 months, and we've seen some fantastic partnership work to address the relationship criminal justice system. It was March when the Lord Chief Justice announced that in England and Wales all new jury trials would be halted until they could be conducted safely. I don't think anybody expected the longevity of the delays caused by the severity of the pandemic, and therefore significant backlogs have started to build both in Crown and Magistrates Courts. We consider it proportionate and appropriate to utilise current governance structures we already have in place, and recognise the need to reduce the burden on our criminal justice partners. It was in December 2019 we'd instated a regional criminal justice collaboration forum within the region, which sat above LCJB level but was designed to bring together collective issues which addressed issues in the region. Meeting was initially planned for the 31st of March 2020, but was delayed in response to the changes in working arrangements and the recognition that our partner agencies are, like us, under quite significant pressure to adapt their business models to operate remotely. Chaired by PCC David Jameson, the meeting was instead held on the 16th of April and provided an opportunity for partners to update on emerging issues in their service areas. It was agreed as part of this meeting that a regional criminal justice recovery working group should be set up to look at the changes that have been required of the criminal justice system as a result of COVID-19 and what can be learned and implemented as part of a future restore. The initial meeting kicked off on the 5th of May. These meetings are predominantly focused on the issues of backlogs within the courts, but have also considered the impact of implementing video-enabled justice and the consideration of the impacts on victims and witnesses. HMCTS have been a key partner during the meetings, and although we've had some frustrations felt with the level of communication between HMCTS, the Ministry of Justice, and LCJB, the progress being made in courts is up and running, and we've maintained a close working relationship with our court representatives to ensure we work in partnership. To assist in the widening of this, we've allowed access to courtrooms across the region. So we've offered up alternative venues to HMCTS, and these can be used in civil cases, which allow more criminal cases to be heard across secure accommodation. It's still ongoing, and partners have been encouraged from central government to continue to identify potential venues. We're now starting to see more movement in courts, and they're being able to operate on a more regular basis. This is a result of a 1 metre plus mitigation rule that's been put in place, and adaptations to docks and benches is ongoing, which will allow further courts to operate. We continue to ensure through the Regional Criminal Justice Group and the Collaboration Forum that we are updated on the progress of each court within the region. Another positive outcome to note is that through the recovery group, we've had the development of a data summary, which shows passing through the whole system, from open and reported crimes through to completed trials. This has been a great piece of work that's been put together by analysts across the West Midlands and Staffordshire OPCCs. This has allowed us to monitor the progress being made against the backlogs and where potential bottlenecks are sitting. The data set is continually being updated and developed and continues to be a focus of the Criminal Justice Data Analyst Group, which sits below the Regional Criminal Justice Forum. Whilst we recover and rebuild, we continue to meet fortnightly and develop and change the focus of the group as the impacts evolve. We'll be keeping in mind the changes the criminal justice agencies are also making internally, and considering the operational impacts across the whole system. Most recently, to note, we've also set up a regional criminal code commissioning working group, which brings together commissioning partners across the criminal justice system and looks to pursue opportunities to commission reducing reoffenders and diversionary activities across the West Midlands footprint. This is being chaired by Regional MPS Director Sarah Chand and brings us in line with the probation changes to the model June 2021. And I'll hand back to Meg at that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think as demonstrated there by Sarah, then our regional structures have been incredibly important in our response to COVID-19 and the pandemic and the issues that has caused for the criminal justice system. Page 4 of the report also sets out our local structures that exist, and actually those structures below the Local Criminal Justice Board continued to meet during that pandemic in a virtual way. And actually that meant that all of those groups, reducing reoffending, victims and witnesses, for example, continued to deliver their priorities, but also continue to identify issues that emerged through the COVID-19 emergency as well. One of the other areas which has developed significantly is work around a disproportionality committee, which will aim to look at disproportionality across the entire criminal justice system. There is a work stream that exists in each of the delivery groups which aims to tackle disproportionality, but this committee wants to take this work further, and it will be chaired by the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the West Midlands, Grace Anonawu. The work will look at previous reports, such as the LAMA review, and will have a focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the BAME community, listening and developing learning and understanding also from the Black Lives Matter movement, including looking at the diversity of the workforce across the various criminal justice agencies. And the group will also look across the whole criminal justice system and use dip sampling to assess compliance with the ambition of that committee and the ambition of the Local Criminal Justice Board. It will also link in with the work that both the OPCC and West Midlands Police are delivering around a broad programme across disproportionality. And in addition to that, in terms of the response to COVID-19, we also set up a early release in response to the early release of prisoners a PCC prison release package, working with our current providers through the period who had some extra capacity due to COVID. The PCC offered support to those that were leaving prison custody during this period, and particularly during the lockdown period. The idea behind that, working with our probation and CRC colleagues, was the hope that that would reduce reoffending. The numbers of prisoners who were released early from custody was much smaller than we had initially anticipated. So actually that became less utilised, but still an important way to bring our partners together and support those that did leave custody. The PCC also commissions a number of services to support reducing reoffending. And throughout the pandemic, particularly during the initial lockdown period, those services were able to continue, albeit in quite a different way. So the Cranston Arrest Referral Service was commissioned by the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, and that's aimed to look at drug and alcohol referrals across the whole West Midlands force area. The aims of that service are really to start to tackle the root causes of criminality, particularly looking at drug and alcohol addiction. And we have seen since that service went live, and also throughout the pandemic, that the numbers of alcohol treatment requirements and drug rehabilitation requirements have significantly increased across the whole of the West Midlands area. It also provides wraparound support to help signpost and support those people to get back on track, whether that be signposting to a range of services such as mental health or housing support. So that service continued to operate over 7 days, continued to operate both with a presence in custody, but also with more staff working from home to provide resilience throughout that pandemic. And equally, our New Chance programme, which is focused on female offenders, which is delivered across the West Midlands force area, continued to work through that pandemic as well. And actually what we found under the New Chance programme and most recent evaluation is that, particularly for those people with substance misuse problems, that the programme helps to decrease reoffending by up to 55%. And that was able to continue into the pandemic through slightly different ways and virtual ways of working. I'm pleased also to say that in August 2020, the New Chance programme was shortlisted by the Howard League for Penal Reform for a community award. And at this point, I will hand over to Sarah Matter, or the Deputy Commissioner, to introduce Sarah through independent custody visiting.
Thank you. Just before I bring Sarah in, I'll just take a pause there to ask if there's any questions on that specific issue around criminal justice. Just to start off, Sarah Gilbert, thank you for the work that you have done and supported in the regional criminal justice setup. And as the chair of the recovery task and finish group, I'm very grateful to all the agencies from the criminal justice agencies that have come together in the spirit of cooperation and partnership working, and have worked through some very, very challenging issues that have been faced here in the West Midlands and across the country in regards to backlog of cases and the recovery and restarting the criminal justice systems. So that we'd like to place that on record. So I'll invite questions first on this particular topic. If I can ask members to be brief, that'd be really helpful. So Jonathan first and then Gurinder.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Before lockdown, there was some very significant announcements, policy announcements relating to changes to the approach to the provision and commissioning of probation services. Is it possible to have an update on when we can expect to see some changes and what those changes might look like, and what opportunities those changes in national approach present for us?
If I start, and perhaps Sarah can come in if I haven't covered the full extent of the answer. But in terms of the probation reforms, we are still looking at June 2021 for the change in that probation footprint. And essentially what that means for us in the West Midlands is that the probation footprint will be the West Midlands region area. So that's the four forces of West Midlands, Staffordshire, Warwickshire and West Mercia. That is a significant change, being that currently probation works across West and East Midlands, and across our West Midlands region we have 2 CRCs that currently operate that footprint. We are working very closely with the regional director of that new West Midlands footprint, and that means that we're also able to start to look at areas of potential co-commissioning. So Sarah Gilbert set out the new working group which looks at regional co-commissioning, which is chaired by Sarah Chand, who is the regional director of the probation service. And we've already started to look with our partners across the OPCCs of areas where co-commissioning could work well, to identify shared gaps, but also to do a piece with wider partners as well to identify any potential points of duplication. So that is continuing to be a priority for us. It's one of the reasons why even pre-COVID we set up the regional structures to enable us to work together with our PCC colleagues from the wider region, and perhaps also why we utilised that regional structure during the pandemic, as it was already set up and operating in a way that would be able to respond to the pandemic itself.
Thank you, Meg. Is anything you want to add, Sarah? Meg covered everything.
The opportunities are also bolstered by the fact that the dynamic framework, which partner agencies can pull contracts off, some of the contracts, particularly around education, training and employment and accommodation, are regional contracts and will have to be contracted across a regional footprint. So it's really important that we do work with our regional partners on this to ensure that the local issues are not lost in this regional framework.
Thank you. I know we've had a number of concerns about the fact that these contracts are regional as opposed to local, which made much more sense in these particular areas. I'll bring Gurinder in and then Brendan, then we'll move on.
Thank you, Wahid. A couple of questions regarding the disproportionality working group that's been established. Firstly, can you give some information about the members of the working group? And then secondly, also, there's a lot of work currently going on by the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office and West Midlands Police around disproportionality, and it's good to see that this is now going into the criminal justice work as well. Would one of the things you would look at include the response to COVID and how that has affected disproportionality? Because sometimes in an emergency situation, the response can actually make things much worse. And if there are lessons to be learned from the response on this, that would be really valuable for future circumstances.
Before you answer that, Brendan, I know you wanted to come in on this area as well. Do you want to come in with your question and then we can take them both together?
I suspect Gurinder and I are on the same track. It was really to ask the question about how we make sure that the work that's being done inside West Midlands Police and with the Commissioner's Office is linked into and forms part of an overall approach to the criminal justice system. Because at one end of the spectrum, we know we've got stop and search. At the other end of the spectrum, we have disposals in magistrates' courts and in Crown courts, and it's that overall picture that's really important. So how we manage to make sure that these two working groups work together seems to me to be really important.
Thank you, Brendan. Meg, do you want to just answer that?
Yes, thank you for those really important questions. So the members of that group are, so basically our local criminal justice board is made up of all of our statutory partners across the criminal justice system. So that is the police, CPS, courts, probation, CRC. And we also have a number of members of that group who are third sector, and supporting criminal justice system. So, for example, victim support. And we also have representatives from, for example, the defence community. So the representation of the the committee focusing on disproportionality will include a representative from all of those agencies. So it is hoped that we will have a representative from across the criminal justice system to make sure that it is a complete sort of whole system approach. In terms of a focus on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, that is something that we have put into the proposal or the proposed work plan. That is absolutely recognised in those initial conversations, and therefore will be one of the key focuses of that committee. I think the point around the link into Westminster Police and the OPCC work, wide programme on disproportionality, is a really important one as well. And as part of that programme, it sets out the approach to criminal justice. So actually, this committee will support those recommendations that the OPCC and WMP have set out by establishing this committee that will bring our partners together across the criminal justice system. So it's absolutely meant to be a complementary committee to support that wider piece of work.
Thank you. Grindy, do you want to come back in? I'll get your hands raised very quickly if I can ask.
Just a very quick comment. I mean, I think that is all very welcome. I think it's a very robust piece of work and commend people for taking it forward. The only other thing I'd add is the membership is quite broad, and there are voluntary third sector organisations included in that. You may want to give some thought about how you take on board the views of the wider community in this, and particularly in relation to perception, because perception can be sometimes very different to the reality in terms of data. And if that's not necessarily being picked up by those members around the table, you may want to give some thought about how you address that.
Yeah, thank you, Corinne. That's a really very important point, and we will pick that up both in the criminal justice disproportionate programme, but also the wider programme that WMP and OPCC are doing jointly as well. So thank you for that. We are due to report on that at some point in the near future, to bring back a comprehensive report to this board. Kath, final question on this one before I move to the other section of this report.
Yes, thank you, Wahid. It's more an observation to just describe some of the ripple effect this is having, the issue with the criminal justice system. There is significant demand on the services who support victims, as they're requiring help for much longer periods of time because their cases have not progressed through the criminal justice system because of the delays. I would commend those support services for their resilience and innovation for helping the victims. However, they need additional financial resources to continue to manage the additional demands into the foreseeable future. So my point in this is that when additional funding is being considered for the criminal justice system as a whole, it should also be matched with funding to victim services, as there is a significant demand at the moment, which is going to continue and be significant in the future because of the backlog in the criminal justice system. So I just want to highlight here, this isn't just about the criminal justice system as in processing through the courts. It's also about the people that are impacted and affected by it.
Thank you, Kath, for that reminder. I know it's important to ensure victims are engaged, and we do engage victims and the services for victims as well are at the forefront of our discussions, and will continue to be so as well, both regionally and also nationally. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to the second part of the report. So I'll invite Sarah Matter to give an overview of the independent custody services and appropriate adults.
Thank you, Wahid. I shall assume that the board has read the report, so I'll try not to cover too much in that. And we have today with us Tony Tyndale, who is currently a custody visitor and appropriate adult, who will talk a bit about his role and also talk about his observations about custody. But before I introduce Tony, I just want to maybe cover a few things about schemes. So before COVID, obviously we would have at least over about 60 custody visitors assigned to their local custody site, so Wolverhampton, Perry Bar, Oldbury and Coventry, and they would do their regular sort of once a week visit into custody. They would also have panel meetings where they would meet probably 3-4 times in the year and have an opportunity to speak with someone from the force as well about custody. We would also do newsletters and have training throughout the year for them. But obviously, since COVID has happened, we've had to postpone a lot of that. And back in March, a lot of our volunteers had to self-isolate after government advice. So we were fortunate enough, though, to have at least a handful, about 5 to 8 custody visitors who were in a position to continue visits, which was great for us, and we were so grateful for them for doing that. So we managed to draw up a rota for both Perry Barr and Aldbury, and we have successfully managed to do a visit at least once a week and report on how the force are managing custody at this present time. Obviously, at the time, Wolverhampton custody was a designated COVID site, so we paused visits there, physical visits, but we worked with the force and managed to get telephone visits done, which have worked well. With Coventry, we tried to get some sort of virtual visit done, but after trying to get the technology going and it failed, we at least tried to call into custody at least once a week and get some form of oversight there. Obviously, you'll refer to the report. There's an Annex 1 in the back of the report that tells you details of the findings of what custody visitors report on. So I won't go over that too much. Just to say that I suppose overall the force have done incredibly well in trying to manage this, on these unusual times. There was always adequate PPE in place for staff, visitors, detainees. I think one of the things that probably I would highlight is the pressure that the virtual remand hearings have been having on the force, and that has come through on the reports. What I will do now is I'll hand over to Tony Tyndale, who will be able to probably tell you a bit more. He's been doing custody visits and appropriate adult visits. So I'll hand over to Tony if he's available.
Thank you, Tony. That's it.
It's all right, I'm unmuted now, so I was muted before. Yes, my name's Tony Tyndale, and I'm an independent custody visitor and also an appropriate adult, and have been for some years. I repeat what Sarah is saying, is the way that the force seems to have coped with the COVID requirements from visits I've been making to Coventry and to Perry Barr. So very pleasing there. One thing about our custody visits, we're quite open about them. We give a copy of the visit at the end of the copy of the report at the end of the visit to the inspector, and we get comments back there and then. But copies also go to Sarah and the PCC's office. However, recently we've been shown around by an inspector. It does seem an awful waste of an inspector's time to come round with us, whereas before we were having custody officers take us round and then asking any questions that arose of the inspector at the end of the visit. A visit normally takes between 1.5 and 2 hours, so it is a large chunk of an inspector's time. A couple of areas that have come up in people in custody is medications. When they're arrested, often on the streets, they don't bring their medications with them. And it's been an issue with the Mountain Healthcare people that they are unwilling, or in fact don't, issue any of the medications that the person needs. And if they're in custody for a long period, say 24 hours, then of course we are getting to the point where they need their medication. The biggest area that we deal with, that I deal with certainly, is appropriate adults. Appropriate adults, those may know, are for vulnerable people over the age of 18. Below that age, social services are supposed to provide the cover. Again, like custody visitors, all of the appropriate adults in the West Midlands are volunteers. And some of the visits we make can be extremely protracted. A colleague recently who was in Wolverhampton reported that he spent 11 hours on a visit. And during that time, when he wasn't actually being used to talk with the person in custody or the inspecting officers, he was asked to sit in his car because there's no room set aside for appropriate adults. I have to sit in Coventry quite often in the entrance foyer with people looking at me oddly because I have a briefcase and they think I'm a solicitor sometimes. The business of medication I mentioned before is an issue, of course, that an awful lot of people we deal with as appropriate adults have mental issues, mental health issues. And although they're picked up by the L&D team and they're a fantastic asset, the troubles with dealing with people with mental issues with the Birmingham and Solihull Mental Health Trust can be difficult. As an example, last week I had a bloke who had been in custody for 22 hours when I was called, and the Mental Health Trust said he didn't need to be sectioned, which is what the police were asking for, so that they had 2 hours for me to come and chat with them, do the interview, and then dispose of the case. As I said, the mental health issue is probably one of the biggest areas, but the people who come in are vulnerable. They either don't understand what's going on, or they can't read and write, so they don't know what's in front of them. They need help. And often I wonder whether, in fact, they have the mental capacity to know what they've been arrested for and have done wrong. Certainly the one last week was that case in point. But as I mentioned, we're all volunteers. We get no payment for this. Although, as I've discovered, and I told Sarah last week, I'm shortly moving to Hereford, where if I become an AA there, I get paid, which would be rather nice. Okay. We do our reports after each visit, and Sarah has those. I don't know whether Sarah shows those reports to anyone else. Do you?
Yes, we do get copies of the report here in the at the PCC and myself. So that those feedback is given to us.
Good, because you'll be getting another report from me shortly. Thank you very much. Are there any questions of me?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much, Tony, for that. I'll just open up to members' questions before we quickly move on. If I can ask the members to keep it very tight, because we are running out of time. Is that you, Brendan? Did you want to come in? Yeah, Brendan.
Thanks, Wahid. A couple of things that struck me having read the report, and particularly on custody visitors. The first is that I dread to think what would have happened had we not moved to centralised custody facilities. I'm not sure we could have coped in any way with COVID-19 and the implications. And the second observation is how different the culture and attitude of the custody staff is to that which existed perhaps 10 years ago. There seems to be a genuine desire to ensure that independent custody visitors get the right level of access and the right level of opportunity to talk to persons in custody. I can recall that wasn't always the case some years ago, and particularly on the TACT remands. Certainly there was a general view that they should be kept well away from those people, whereas that culture clearly has changed. So I would applaud both the custody visiting staff and indeed the custody visitors for their contribution to that very significant change in culture.
Thank you, Brendan. Chief Exec and Sarah want to come in. Can I just ask both of you if you could keep it very brief? That'd be very helpful. Thank you, Chief Exec.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner, and I'm grateful to Tony and his colleagues for the work they do, both as visitors and appropriate adults. But a question is to Sarah Matter and potentially to the force as well. While the report sets out how we've managed to maintain an appropriate adult service for vulnerable adults, do we have any information about the extent to which we've been able to maintain the appropriate adult service to children, which is a duty of the local authorities to provide?
Sarah, do you have an answer to that?
There's nothing, through the reports given by ICVs, I've had nothing to suggest there were any concerns about the AA provisions for juveniles in custody. I don't know whether the force could add anything more on that, but we've not had any major concerns about that. So,
thank you, sir. Can I invite the Chief Constable? Do you have a...
I couldn't tell you today. We'd have to report back on that, I'm afraid. It's not been raised up as a current pressing issue. I know sustaining schemes is always important. There's a lot of work goes on around that, but I don't know if we've got... certainly nothing's been flagged up as having had a problem, but I can report back to you if that's required.
That'd be very helpful, Chief Constable, if we can pick that up outside of the meeting and any reports back. Jonathan, did you want to come back in?
Very quickly, sir, we'll pick that up with the minutes, and also I will take away the point that that Tony made about remuneration of appropriate adults in other areas, and come back to you and the Commissioner on what the options are in relation to that.
Thank you. And Sarah Marwick, who wanted to come in.
Thank you. There's too many Sarahs today, aren't there? Tony, I'd also like to pass on my thanks to you and your colleagues for the good work that you do. It's absolutely invaluable. My question is around the reports from the different custody blocks. Generally very positive, but there does seem to be a recurring theme around simple practical issues, such as things like provision of washing facilities and feminine hygiene products and things like that. Are we confident that those issues are addressed? Because these should be basic things we should be getting right.
Certainly from recent visits I've been making, yes, feminine hygiene and washing facilities are being provided, particularly, of course, now as some people are in custody for much longer periods because of COVID. But showers are available and they're told about that, because we do check on that when we go around. That's
great. I think that answers the question I was going to ask the Chief Constable. I think Tony's answered that question very adequately. Thank you. And at that point, I'll close this agenda item. Just to place again on a record our thanks to the independent custody visitors and to the project others. As Tony said, they do this voluntarily and in their spare time. So I'm very grateful to them. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, our appropriate adult volunteers have continued to support the most vulnerable people in custody, despite the additional strain upon them due to a large number of volunteers having to self-isolate. In spite of this, it is imperative that vulnerable adults are being supported. The work of our volunteers, including appropriate adults, enables vulnerable adults in custody to have access to fair justice and ensure that they know their rights. So thank you. I'll move swiftly on to the next agenda item. We are slightly running behind on time. So on that basis, if I may ask Chief Superintendent Claire Bell to come in, and if you could just assume that everybody's read the report. So if you just pick out key points. Chief Constable, I think, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I'll just say some stuff first, and then Claire will, kind of pick up any key points and ably help us answer any of the questions that might arise. So I'm conscious this report comes at an incredibly topical time with the new restrictions that were placed on social gatherings on Monday, and clearly with Birmingham, Sandwell and Solihull entering into areas of national intervention, the additional restrictions that take place on Tuesday in those areas. So this has become at a very focused time. I suppose there's a number of points I'd want to make really in terms of the approach and issues that I think we've been emphasising. The first is I think it's all important we just reflect back a little bit back to when we were all outside the front of our houses clapping for carers and being united against the challenge. The reason I say that is there is a danger, I think, as we enter into reimposing some restrictions, that we look for other people to point the finger at as to why this may have happened. And I think this is really important to be very clear. These issues were always identified as a risk by the government as society opened up. So clearly there will be people, no doubt, who have relaxed about restrictions. There will some people, as there always were, who don't find restrictions things they want or do comply with. But actually, this was always a risk from the start, and it's important to recognise that that was a collective risk we faced as a country and a population, and now is not the time to point to other people and say it's their fault, because it was always the risk we accepted. Clearly, we do accept there's been a danger of some relaxation in terms of parts of the population. I know there's been a considerable narrative about younger people. I've always said right from the start, we understand fully how difficult this is, for very young people and also vulnerable people who are restricted and are shielding more heavily. And that has underpinned, I think, the approach the force has tried to take to get people to adhere and to exercise, I think, and use the 4 E's around this. I think we'd all reflect as we were young people once, even though it might feel quite a long time ago, that losing your son at 18 is far more challenging than I think the experience we've all had. So policing recognises that. I think in terms of the approach that we're taking, the 4 E's still remain, I think, a tried and well-tested approach that we're following. I think the work we've done on Reliant to do with large unauthorised music events and other gatherings, barbecues, car cruises, etc., has shown actually we've been able to achieve the effect policing wants and deter these events without necessarily using considerable amount of enforcement. I think we will try where we can to use our approach to achieve the right behaviour. It doesn't mean that that has to be solely achieved as a result of using 1 E of enforcement. Yesterday, clearly, we saw the changes. It's important to recognise, I think this is very clear from the government, that we did not receive guidance until today about the new regulations and how they'll be implemented. Claire is working through the process of providing the guidance. I think that's important because, as we know, many of these regulations are formed. There's a reasonable pace, and the College of Policing with the Home Office do considerable work to offer guidance and interpretations. So I would expect some of those areas to come into force in terms of guidance from today. Clearly, the new regulations in terms of Birmingham actually start from today on Tuesday, and again we'll be working through how they apply. In terms of the focus of our activities, just really worth re-emphasising a number of points. The areas of national intervention will be the areas where there is an enhanced level of concentration from the force because the infection rate's higher. We work as part of an incident management team with the led by the local authorities, directors of public health, to work out what's the best way the multi-agent response can support the public in containing infection risk. That does mean where police will focus will be based upon geographic areas where there is an enhanced risk of infection. It'll be aspects of society that show an enhanced risk of infection. On occasions, it will also relate to key groups where we think there's a risk. Always worth remembering, the approach to all of those groups will use the full 4 E's and is part of a multi-agency response that follows the epidemiological risk. Finally, just a point I'd re-emphasise that I asked the public to do. I'm quite sure that people will see examples where people are breaching the rules. I would ask that if people want to notify us around breaches, they do it using the online form on our website. And if need be, web chat. Clearly, if we had very large, dangerous, unauthorised events with large crowds, that would probably be appropriate to phone us more urgently. But I do need to strongly emphasise that not phoning the 999 system or the 101 system will be important because the policing activity now is very busy. There's a lot of high demand on the police service in this month, and that's a very different position than we're in lockdown. I hope that gives a good indication of the approach we're taking. Claire will pick out perhaps a couple of points from the report and then we'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Chief Constable. If I can invite Chief Superintendent Claire, but if you could just keep it very short, assuming that everybody's read the report, that'd be very grateful. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. There isn't really that much more to add other than, I suppose, to reinforce that we are at normal levels of crime demand with seasonal rises as you would expect. So we've got some more concentrated nighttime economy in our cities rather than all our towns. But we've already mentioned Operation Reliant, where we're seeing between 150 and 200 incidents each weekend. That has settled now into a pattern of more house parties, with some licensing prices causing us some concern. But we will see what impact the new rules are in the coming weekend. I guess the emphasis I would add to what the Chief Constable already said is that we need to see our activity and our intervention as enforcement in the broadest sense, not just the issuing of fixed penalty notice. So Operation Reliant has taught us that actually the whole spectrum of intervention that the police can take part in alongside partners is what is going to be a more sustainable approach to working with the public what's going on. So, for example, intervention that we're able to take on the morning in terms of licensing activity can be more effective than issuing or trying to issue to party goers. So that's something that I think is worth drawing out and something that we'll be able to communicate
You might have to camera off because your voice is breaking heavily.
Claire, we can't hear you very well. If you can switch your camera off, that might improve the sound quality. Sorry.
My apologies. Is that better without the video on?
Yes, that's a lot better. Yes.
I'm sure what I've said is repeating the Chief Constables. I'm conscious of time, so I won't repeat what I've said. Perhaps it's easier to take questions. My apologies.
That's fine. No worries. Thank you for that. Can I invite the Commissioner to ask this first question, Commissioner?
Yes, thank you very much, Chief Constable. I mean, a lot of interest from the public and from the media. New regulations came in yesterday. How did things go? And just another question as well, so I'll put the two together. In paragraph 9 of the report, you say that there's a particular challenge around large events held in private dwellings, as there's no power of entry under COVID legislation for police officers. Is this a major omission in the legislation?
So I think in terms of yesterday, and Claire can jump in if she wishes to add anything particularly, I think yesterday was raising awareness in the force, reminding staff of the recording requirements we needed to take. We've not been able to analyse the calls we received yesterday, but I do think we were quite busy in terms of calls and reporting. There was a minimal level of enforcement done yesterday, and that reflected the fact we didn't receive the national government guidelines yesterday, and we've received them this morning. The general advice nationally was that we should not immediately move into applying new regs until we'd seen the legislation and the interpretation that was being provided by the College of Policing. So I think a gearing up, communicating, preparation, but actually not any particular substantial areas. Claire, is there anything you want to add from yesterday before I talk directly about the power of entry?
No, just some specifics that we did have a more noticeable policing presence around our key areas that you've already described. We saw most of the calls and activity coming from the public in Birmingham, West and Coventry, interestingly. And we are seeing a step up since Friday, really, when this became known to the public in terms of our directions to leave. We have had 9 directions to leave and 2 fixed pension notices in the last 36 hours, which is an increase, and we would expect that to move upwards as we go. And as you say, as there's clarity around the actual regulations for staff. Thank
you. I think then in addition to this,
Claire, could you also?
I was going to cover the power of entry.
Could I just ask Claire on that particular point? Could you just confirm that the enforcement activity or the advice that you've given has been widespread across the geography of the area? Because we have heard some calls from members of parliament that their constituency should be left out because there's no problems there. Could you just confirm they are widespread, that this activity that you're doing?
Yes, Commissioner, absolutely. So there is a step up in our policing activity across the whole force area. And then there is a next tier up for those areas that have been declared as national intervention. And that's where we'd expect to see the concentration of force resources and additionality, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Chief Constable.
In terms of the power of entry, Chief Constables have been very keen not to have a power of entry into private dwellings for COVID enforcement. I think we are very clear the police is delivering a level of enforcement that's extraordinary. In our history since 1829, we've not enforced public health legislation. There are aspects where we were able on occasion to use normal powers of entry, where there is criminality taking place. We are able, I think, where gatherings are organised, often by other enquiries to identify who may be the organiser. Actual power of entry to control COVID compliance issues, I think, does run the risk of placing some tensions around the policing by consent model, is the view of Chief Constables, and whether an acceptance from the public will be at that level. So we've not encountered particular problems over that, I have to say. If we feel there are large gatherings that are breaching the rules, that are substantial, we do have that deterrence of the £10,000 fine for organisers. We can usually use other enquiries to find out who's in control of the premises. It's not something I feel at the moment would be necessary for the police, and I'm not sure it's something at the moment that would command broad public support.
Commissioner?
Thank you.
Okay, I've got Tom McNeill next and then Jonathan after that. Tom.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Obviously, you've been asked previously by this board about concerns from the public that there might sometimes be a disproportionate focus from the police of enforcement against certain BAME communities. Could you just offer a few words around what West Midlands Police do to ensure that their enforcement activity isn't disproportionate?
Sure. I mean, obviously, Claire will touch a little bit around the tracking we do in terms of the COVID app, the review we do, the scrutiny of the use of direction to leave and the use of FPNs. And I think I'd kind of make a couple of points, really. First is to say the actual level of enforcement that we would classify as enforcement, i.e. a fixed penalty, is incredibly low from these figures if you look at the intended period in. I think that reflects the style of policing the force has been using and the whole approach around the 4Zs, which is to engage, because we recognise this is really tough, difficult legislation, etc. So I think that's the starting point. The other factor also, these are a complex, mix of factors that will generate police involvement and attendance around it. And we clearly do see some disproportionality in the data, particularly young people feature very highly, and we would accept that actually where the police are acting and involved, it is not the same every demographic. I think the additional data now offers a very different proposition, I think, than the challenges that we faced at the start of lockdown, where we were largely, I think, universally trying to manage issues. And clearly, with largely empty streets, it was pretty apparent who was breaking and where we should focus. The challenge the service faces now in West Midlands is we've got 3 areas in national intervention. We have seen the return of normal business, so we are actually quite busy with normal business. So the capacity to simply concentrate on COVID is much degraded from where we were. And of course, that couples with the potential impact of increased degradation on staff in the force because of self-isolation issues that we now have to start considering more frequently than we were a few weeks ago. And of course, the other issues now, the epidemiological data is very specific and precise. So it will identify particular geographical areas, aspects of social life and potentially demographic groups that are maybe at more risk of infection. And I would hope the public see the police intervention as intervening in that precise way based upon risk and trying to minimise infection. That is potentially difficult because clearly that demographic data may not always reflect the overall population indications and figures. And so what we will be intending to do as far as we're able to with the local IMTs is be extremely clear why we are in particular areas and what activity we are addressing to ensure that we actually increase legitimacy, because actually trying to ensure proportionate enforcement might be actually very hard to achieve and maybe the wrong thing, because actually it may not be where the infection risk is. So this is incredibly tricky, it's incredibly delicate, but what I would say is there's an extremely low level of enforcement, there's an extremely high level of encouragement and education going on, and it's extremely focused on where greatest risk is now, and they're all the things we'd expect the police to do.
Thank you, Chief Constable. I'll move on to the Chief Executive, Jonathan.
Thank you. Two quick questions, if I may, Deputy Commissioner. First of all, is there any update on the requirements that have been placed on the force in relation to the enforcement of quarantine for international travellers? How much demand is supporting the work of the border force placing on the force? And secondly, there's been some coverage in the last couple of weeks relating to the availability of tests for individuals with COVID symptoms. Have any such delays in accessing tests had any operational implications for police officers and staff who are showing symptoms? Has that created any problems with people having to wait for tests?
Claire, do you want to go first on these, and then any areas that you're unclear on, I'll pick up.
Yeah, thank you. So for the quarantine referrals, this is something that we have given to our force support unit. They've been doing this now for many weeks. And they are able to do that and absorb that into their normal business. So the feedback, both in terms of numbers and feedback from the staff, is that it doesn't cause them any concern at all. In June we had 45, July 110 and August 88. This month so far we've had 41, so quite stable numbers. And we're kind of averaging 25-ish per week. But as I say, it's more than manageable. There has been no enforcement action taken against any of those referrals either. In relation to the testing, I think that the testing availability issues have been quite recent, and we have only had across the whole period of COVID 70 positive tests for our organisation. So to draw a conclusion about the impact firmly would be difficult at this stage. However, anecdotally, we have had to test some staff from the operations department and we were offered testing quite far afield. So it's something that we're keeping our eye on, but I wouldn't want to overly come down on one side or the other at the moment until we have a fuller picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think that answered that question. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for board members for the question, and the Chief Constable and Claire for your answers. Obviously, we are moving into some very challenging times again with this virus and infection rates increasing, especially in the areas of extra issues in Birmingham, Solihull and Sandwell, which will no doubt put extra pressures on the police service. We have seen significant increases of illegal parties over weekends, which is having a huge strain on resources as well for the police. So I would urge people to follow the new regulations, to understand that this is there for their safety and for the safety of their loved ones. And the awful disease is still with us and is a deadly disease that can result in people dying. So it's very important that we rely on the public to self-police themselves and engage and support themselves and follow the rules. The police will, of course, as the Chief Constable set out, will work with the communities through the 4E approach and will only use enforcement as a last resort. And there's enhanced activity happening across the West Midlands, but concentration on those areas of significant concern. So on that point, I'll hand back over to the Commissioner.
Thank you very much indeed, Wahid. Thank you for the presentations and those of us answered questions as well. And could I just say a particular thank you to Tony Tyndale, our custody visitor and appropriate adult. Thank you for coming in on those items as well. Right, we now move on to item 7, which is the finance budget monitoring. And I'm going to go over to Mark Kenyon, our finance officer, to give his report. Mark.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll just quickly go over the main highlights of the report and welcome any questions at the end. This report details the revenue and capital expenditure forecast for the current financial year. It's based on information up to the end of July. So the main highlights of the report are there's predicted to be a revenue overspend of around £2.3 million. And this is mainly because of the costs relating to COVID that currently the government has not indicated it will reimburse or compensate the PCC for. This includes expenditure on such items as IT to facilitate home working, overtime costs, some estates costs and a proportion of external income. So within that assumption, the force and the PCC currently assume the expenditure on the national PPE order and the expenditure on local medical graded PPE order, should I say, will be reimbursed by the government. And also 75% of the lost income this year in relation to things like fees and charges, sort of airport income, will be reimbursed by the government as well. But we haven't actually had any details, firm details yet around that 75% and how it will work. So after those reimbursements, it will leave a net cost of COVID of around £4.5 million on the force and the PCC. And this obviously assumes that there's no increased activity in relation to COVID. So, for example, if there's further restrictions in relation to lockdowns and the implications that might have on costs aren't factored in here. So other areas of the force, if we sort of move away from COVID, there's expected to be an underspend on police staff, police officer and staff pay. And this is predominantly to the sort of profiling of police recruitment, but it has been offset to some extent by increased costs in overtime. The external income I've referred to already, and just repeat again, there's an assumption that 75% of that will be referred back. All costs in relation to COVID and the financial implications of COVID we're reporting to government on a monthly basis, along with all other PCCs, to ensure that government's got an accurate picture on the actual impact of COVID on PCCs. And these are really the costs that were outlined in the emergency chapter report we just talked about. So the overall impact of that predicted £2.3 million overspend in revenue will mean that we have to draw down further on reserves this financial year. And this will be drawing down the budget reserve. This will mean that the balance that we had at the end of March, which was about 9 million, will be predicted to go down to around 5 million by the end of this financial year, which obviously means that in terms of those usable reserves we have, apart from those ones with the day-to-day operation of the force, will be more or less at zero level. So the report then talks about capital. There's a phased underspend of around £12 million forecast for this current financial year. And that again is due to sort of the implications of COVID, in particular the impact on the stage programme, which has obviously meant that things have been put back. But as I pointed out, this was really around phasing, so we expect that expenditure in future years. And just a final point is really the long-term forecast of resources for the PCC will be brought to the board at a future meeting through the medium-term financial plan, which will obviously take into account of the long-term impacts or forecasts of COVID on the force and the PCC. So that's all I wanted to say in terms of an introduction. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. I mean, I can't help reflecting some of the criticism we had about carrying reserves. It's a good job we had some of those reserves. Otherwise, we'd be in a serious position now, because the government hasn't undertaken, well, it has undertaken, but it hasn't yet provided the extra funding that we require. Could just for clarity, back in May, in an emergency situation, we underwrote a national program of buying PPE, protection equipment, for across the country. In other words, to help other forces. We weren't the only force to do it, but several forces did. Now, the government has given an absolute guarantee that money will return to us. I understand it's not yet appeared after all these months. And the second one is, could you just confirm the net extra expenditure we've had, which would include also our loss of income? What is that figure, that the actual, what we wouldn't have spent had it not been for COVID, and put into that factor in the loss of income? Could you just give that figure just for clarity for the public?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of that national PPE order, as you say, we have had assurances that it will be paid, but we haven't actually received it yet in terms of our bank account. That comes over, that's around just over £4 million. So it is critical that we get that money back in this financial year in terms of our overall financial position. So the net cost of COVID at the moment is around £4.5 million on the force and the PCC. And that assumes that we will get elements of that national order back and other aspects as well that I've referred to. So at the moment, if the government reimburses the costs, which we expect to be reimbursed for, we will still be in a position where we're £4.5 million worse off.
And does that include the loss of income?
It includes an aspect of the loss of income, yes, because the government has said they'll pay 75% of the loss of income. So there's 25% that we're still having to carry within that £4.5 million.
Okay, we await the government. Kath, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. Mark, this is a question about police now recruitment. There's an indication there that 1.52 million has been spent as additional funding. Could you give us an idea on what that's been spent on?
Yeah, sure. So that's from my understanding, that's obviously around sort of recruiting additional officers through that programme to make sure we get the levels of recruitment this financial year and to the actual levels we want.
Have you got an idea of what additional activities have required such an increase of funding though?
I'm not aware of the specific details, Kath. I can come back to you on that just to find a breakdown of what that actually is.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. Are there any other questions or points that everyone wants to make to Mark? I can see no hands at the moment. Are there any other questions?
Commissioner, could I just ask?
No, if that's the... Yes, of course, Brendan. Yes, come in.
Thank you. Mark, just so I've got it clear in my head, if the government failed to repay the PPE commitment and also fail to make good the 75% loss on income, my sort of rough calculation is that would put the force in a position where it was just over 10.5 million overspent at the end of the year. My guess is if that worst case scenario occurred, the effect would be to wipe out all of our reserves, so we would actually have zero.
Well, yeah, I think what we would have to do in the first place, Brendan, is look at ways we can save money in the short term if that was possible. But if we weren't able to do that, obviously we would have to use reserves to make sure that we had a balanced position at the end of the year. So you are correct. Okay.
So, and just on the 75% income compensation, is the difficulty with that commitment is that their definition of what our income might be and our definition might be at variance. So is there any recognition in the Home Office of what our annual income might have been had it not been for COVID, such that we can be reasonably assured that the 75% is being calculated on a common basis?
Yeah, the way I understand this, and we're still waiting for further information, it's based on 75% of your budgeted income. Right. So it's not your actual, it's your budgeted income. Okay. So it's important, obviously.
There should be common ground between us and them, because that's a publicly available figure at the start of the year.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mark, just to be clear, just leaving aside any money that may come from the government, we're overspent by about £10 million at the moment. But as you say, we've had promises from the government some of this money will come back. Is that figure about correct?
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll just reiterate the point. You know, it's a good job we had some in reserve, and there were those who are criticising us, saying we should spend all our reserves a while back. And it looks like prudence has taken us into its stride here, and we're in a good position. Okay. Well, we look forward to hearing whether the government return some of that money to us, and we'll be reporting on that shortly. Okay, thank you. Is there any other point anyone wants to raise? Okay, if not, we then move on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the chief.
I think we're just about to. Oh, we've got David back again. Chief Constable, sorry, do you want to?
Yeah, I think I've covered off the two principal areas I want to do in the update today. So I think I'll leave it at that today, if that's acceptable.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Chief. Item 9 is the work plan for this committee. over to you, Jonathan.
Only to report, so the next meeting on the 20th of October is an update on recruitment. So there'll be a lot of interest in that. That relates to both the delivery of the uplift, the targets around police officers recruitment that have been set, and also our progress against increasing the diversity of the force. There will also be a report on the change programme, but otherwise the report on the work plan is for noting. So we'll also be able to bring forward at the next meeting our proposals for the board meetings in calendar year 2021, based on our best understanding of the likely timetable for the election in May.
Okay, is there any point or question anyone wants to make on the work plan? No. So could I just then complete the meeting by reiterating to you, Chief Constable, thank you very much indeed for the work that you and your office have done. This has been a particularly challenging and difficult period. So well done to all your officers for what they've done in that period of time. I mean, I do note we are here to hold you to account on behalf of the public, but we are also there to support you in the truly excellent work that you have had to do. I think we're going to have more challenging times ahead, and I've said repeatedly since June, when we produced the Future Generations paper, that I do have major concerns about large numbers of young people, particularly young men, who will find themselves unemployed. And if the furlough scheme isn't extended beyond the end of October, we could see large numbers of young men without a job and without money in their pocket. And that could lead to considerable problems for a minority of them. We're also going to look very closely at those children who have missed a large portion of their education. We're getting indications. The good news is that most children have now gone back to school and have got re-involved in their education. But there still is a concern that some children may present difficulties. And we're hearing from the schools one or two things that we need to look at in case those lead to children getting involved in things like county lines and other criminal activity. So I'm going to ask board members if you will stay on the call, please. But there I will